Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Brissenden Smith. I'm a partner with Impact Media Partners, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to a 60-minute moderated panel discussion featuring special preview footage from the powerful new film, Single Use Planet. We're joined today by special guests from Physicians for Social Responsibility, Tulane University Environmental Law Clinic, and the Breathe Project for a conversation moderated by Juan Gonzalez from Democracy Now! On the politics, science, and environmental impact of single-use plastics. To start us off, we'll see a brief trailer for the film, and then Juan will join us to begin the conversation. Thank you for being here.
A lot of people getting diagnosed with cancer.
Forgive me, folks.
Plastic, the miracle stuff that's become indispensable to modern life, except for what's not. The throwaway, single-use trash that overwhelms all efforts to recycle. Can the genie be put back in the bottle? We'll look at a way to stop the deluge and what's holding that effort back.
Have you gotten to see what's going on at the Shell petrochemical facility, also known as the cracker plant? 4,500 trade jobs, and it's going to peak this summer at 6,500.
They're saying that they're going to get rid of plastic. You know, they're trying to get rid of plastic straws and all of these other stuff. But the plants are still coming in.
A lot of people getting diagnosed with cancer. When you burying young people, when you burying middle-aged people, that's not their time.
I think it's all about money. I think money play a big part in them letting these industry come in here.
We keep buying plastic, using plastic, so they're going to make it here or elsewhere.
There are more lobbyists than there are state legislators.
There is nothing nefarious about that. It is an open and transparent process.
Bags I tried to ban plastic bags in Louisiana. That went over like a lead balloon. He got killed in committee. I couldn't get out onto the Senate floor.
Lobbyists don't only bring education and expertise, they also organize fundraisers.
Government has lost its purpose. It's supposed to be here for people, not bottom lines and Wall Street and special interests.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Juan Gonzalez, the co-host of Democracy Now!, and it's my pleasure to be here to have a panel discussion on this amazing new film. I want to tell you who the panel is, and then give you a quick, brief introduction and ask each of the panelists to give their perspective and their viewpoint of why this film is so important. We're joined today by Ned Catayer, Dr. Ned Catayer he's the president of Physicians for Social Responsibility in Pennsylvania. Matt Mihalik, who is the executive director of the Breathe Project, and Kimberly Terrell, a staff scientist at Tulane University's Environmental Law Clinic. A lot of this film deals with the plastics industry in Pennsylvania. I was a reporter in Pennsylvania for many years and at the Philadelphia Daily News, and I recall in the early 1980s doing a series of articles back then. We titled it Cancer Zones, which was about this extraordinary number of Philadelphia residents who were dying in two particular communities in Philadelphia, the South Philadelphia areas and the zip codes around two large petroleum refineries at the time. And there was an Arco petroleum refinery and a Sunoco petroleum refinery within the Philadelphia city limits. And then in the Bridesburg section of Northeast Philadelphia, where they're in the census tracts immediately around two large chemical plants, petrochemical plants, one operated by Allied Chemical and the other one by Roman Haas. And it was the number of deaths that were occurring were extraordinary, given the fact Philadelphia already had the 8th highest cancer rate of any county in the United States. The legislature of Pennsylvania, as a result of this series, eventually created a cancer registry because they weren't even tracking incidences of cancer or deaths from cancer at that time. And of course, the petrochemical industry is so crucial in the number of toxic chemicals that it produces. But here, particularly, this film deals with single-use plastics and this product that we don't really need. That there's no basic need in our society for single-use plastics, but they are completely polluting our planet. So I wanted to ask each of the panelists if they could talk a little bit about why this film is so important to them. And I wanted to start with Matt Mihalik of the Breathe Project in Pennsylvania.
Hi, Juan. Thank you so much for organizing this panel and hosting the discussion about this movie. I'm Matt Mihalik. I'm with the Breathe Project. We're located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We're a coalition of about 65 different community groups, resident groups, professional organizations, public health professionals, monitoring technology professionals, working together to improve air quality in our corner of the state. We have a cancer situation in Allegheny County, in the Pittsburgh area, and also in Beaver County, where the Shell ethane cracker plant is located. Now, why this movie is so important is that our region has a long history of embracing heavy industry that creates this high volume, low margin commodity business model that relies upon use of lots of toxic materials and typically leaves in its wake a lot of health harms for people who live in the region, especially people who live close by to these facilities. And so the Shell plant that was announced in 2016 is going to be, and it's coming up to speed currently. They're in the commissioning phase of this plant, and we're seeing all sorts of issues with this plant already, and that's what we predicted. Many of us over the past 6 or 7 years, trying to advocate for that to not move forward. Our region risks being put in a bad situation once again by being tied to these toxic facilities at a time when we need to be moving away from these things, where we need to be moving our region's economy away from climate polluting assets that are going to be stranded and the health harms that come from that. So this movie does a lot to capture how really the entire business model doesn't work for most people. It works for a few people, but most people actually are harmed by this. And of course, our planet is as well too. So thank you for inviting me to be part of this discussion. And I'm happy to respond to the panel and look forward to the conversation.
Well, thanks, Matt. And I'd like to hear also now from Dr. Nitka Tyer, who's president of Physicians for Social Responsibility in Pennsylvania, on why you think this film is so important, not only for the people attending here, but for once the films start spreading across the country for others to view.
Thank you, Juan. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you all for joining us today. Look, it's undeniable that petrochemicals like single-use plastic makes modern life more convenient and more comfortable, but it's also undeniable that petrochemicals and plastics cause enormous damage to the environment, to our health, and to the planet's climate system. And I think the film makes that quite clear. Plastic delivers the toxic goods like a time-released capsule throughout its lifespan, beginning at the wellhead where oil and gas is fracked out of the ground, and other infrastructure, pipelines, compressors, gas processing facilities and refineries, bomb trains, and ethane cracker plants where the polyethylene nurdles are born. And then one day, after 15 seconds of use, or 15 minutes, or 15 hours, we decide that we're done with it. But the damage doesn't stop at the trash can or in the landfill, or as litter on our highways and waterways, or as broken down microplastics that choke wildlife and eventually human life too. So with the good comes the bad, and in this case, it's very bad. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here today with all of you to talk about the human health impacts of single-use plastic throughout its lifespan.
And thanks. And we're also joined by Kim Terrell from Tulane University, staff scientist there. And Kim, you're in the belly of the beast, in the Cancer Alley of Louisiana. And if you could talk about why this film, particularly for your community and the area that you research and service, is so important.
Thank you, Juan. Yeah, that's a great way to describe it. I think the film is really important because it includes the voices of community members who are impacted by this type of petrochemical activity. No solution that we can come up with to address plastic waste will also address the pollution that those community members are exposed to. So I think it's important to always consider, where did this product start out? What community did it start out in? And are they already overburdened with pollution? So one thing that we've seen in our state, decade after decade, is a lack of research on the human health toll of petrochemical activity, including plastic production. And whenever there's a lack of research, there's going to be a lack of evidence. So one common sentiment that we hear down here is that the burden of proof should not be on the community to show that this is a problem. The burden of proof should be on the operator to demonstrate that you can emit hundreds of tons of toxic pollutants, within a few hundred feet of people's homes, and somehow do that safely, right? So we know that ultimately the pollutants coming out of these facilities are regulated because they're known to have health impacts. The science has already been done. We also know that the people in these communities don't receive their fair share of the economic benefits of plastic production and of petrochemical manufacturing in general. Again and again in Louisiana, we see Black and low-income communities being targeted for these types of manufacturing facilities. And oftentimes, by the time they find out about it, the decisions have already been made. So I think this film is really important to highlight those perspectives and to give those communities a larger platform so that they can successfully stop projects like Formosa Plastics that's trying to build a massive new facility in St. James, Louisiana. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, well, what we're going to do now is we're going to look at a few clips from the film, and then have some of our panelists respond to those clips, and then have a general discussion. And for those of you who are in the audience, you can learn more about the film just by going to the website of single-use planetmovie.org, single-use-planetmovie.org. So let's take a look at one of the first clips in the film.
I got a crown up in the kingdom, ain't that good news?
1,000 miles downstream from Pennsylvania, where the Mississippi meets the Louisiana bayous, the plastic industry, again invited by elected office holders, has been welcomed by some, but not all.
I wish they had one of you women up there, and I think we would stand a fair chance, because women, they think about their children and their grandchildren, and what do they really want? I sat down the other day, and I took out a page and
numbered it from 1 to 50. I got to 35. And that's 35 people that I know personally who have died from cancer just in this area.
The plant Formosa that's coming in the 5th district is less than 2 miles from the nearest St. Louis Academy. When they have recess, they go outside, so they're breathing in your chemicals that you're letting out into the air.
Proposed Sunshine Project and respectfully request the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality approve our air permits.
Dueling testimonies have become routine at public hearings on such permits, especially around emissions data provided by companies seeking the permit.
This project will be designed and engineered to minimize emissions and meet all applicable ambient air standards.
So with respect to Formosa specifically, there will be 95 tons per year of cancer-causing substances released into the environment. And we know the complex that Formosa wants to build would be massive. 14 different units on a 2,000-acre site that collectively would emit more than 800 tons per year of toxic air pollution.
The air pollutants that Formosa Plastics would be allowed to emit would add to what prevailing winds already carry from the other petrochemical plants surrounding St. James.
Benzene, formaldehyde, and ethylene oxide. And Formosa is permitted to emit large quantities of all 3 of those pollutants, which are all known to be carcinogens.
DEQ failed to evaluate the cumulative impacts of toxic air emissions.
Wilma Subra is a chemist and a recipient of a MacArthur Genius Award, whose expert testimony is sought worldwide on the health effects of chemical emissions.
Frequently, I'm fighting a lot of the industry people, and frequently the local people in the area work for those industries. I'll get a phone call and they'll say, you know, I always oppose what you were saying, but my wife or my child or my mother just came down with cancer or leukemia.
So Kim Terrell, you were featured in that portion of the clip we played. Tell us about this Formosa Plastics, 800 tons per year, permitted just for them alone, added to all the other plants that are in that same area. Could you talk about the overall impact that has on a community?
Yes. So there's been work done by ProPublica showing that plant alone, that single plant, would more than double the toxic level of air pollution in that heavily industrialized community. So it's a little bit misleading to think about it as one plant. It's actually a mega complex of 14 individual facilities, each of which has their own air permit. So 14 units large enough by each of themselves to be considered a facility that requires an air permit. So the effect would be massive.
And I'd like to ask Dr. Katayar, when you hear these numbers in terms of emissions, what you think?
It's a lot of pollution, and it's a lot of air toxics that residents living nearby are breathing morning and night. And especially, families that maybe don't have the protection of an efficient HVAC system, where they can't get a reprieve from the pollution for 8 hours or 10 hours every day. The burden is even greater. We know that schools have leaky facilities where children can be exposed throughout the day. And it's very worrisome, but nobody should be surprised that people are getting sick when they're exposed to these types of chemicals in the air.
Okay, let's go to another clip from the film.
I think it's all about money. I think money play a big part in them letting these industry come in here.
Me personally, I'm gonna get around here and try to change some things with our elections, because we need people in the office that gonna love people and not money.
If there's some way you could separate and have someone run for office that doesn't depend on contributions for industry.
In this part of the world, we call that shenanigans. It's definitely going on.
Where office holders get their election campaign money is, to a degree, public information. And not surprisingly, those who routinely support bills to benefit a particular industry receive generous contributions from that industry, money they might need to get elected. Over his career in office, Mike Turzai received several $100,000 from the oil, gas, and petrochemical industries. And after resigning as Speaker of the House, he started a new job as General Counsel for one of the largest providers of natural gas. Senator Jake Corman. In 2019, he successfully halted a ban on single-use plastic bags. He too has received large campaign donations from the industries involved. Overall, since 2008, candidates and office holders in Pennsylvania and Louisiana have received tens of millions of campaign dollars from these same industries.
If someone gives you a very large check and they want you to return their phone call, you will. I know this because my mother expects that.
There's a lot of good people in both the House and the Senate who want to do well. It's just to get these outside forces, you know, they have an agenda, and if you go against these businesses, they will put somebody in your race and raise a lot of money to run against you.
They can dump a lot of money, big time money into people, and that's how many of my colleagues have won before.
When you talk to people one-on-one, many of my colleagues, they believe in whatever the bill is that you're presenting, but they're scared of not being reelected.
This has gone on for decades. It's not Republican or Democrat. We've had both Republican and Democrat governors that have sold their soul.
Campaign money may or may not buy a person's soul, but its influence is not limited just to legislators. Former governors Bobby Jindal of Louisiana and Tom Corbett of Pennsylvania each pushed hard to lure the giant ethane crackers to their state, and both were on the receiving end of big campaign money from the industries involved.
So I'd like to ask Matt Mihalik, one of the legislators in the film says in Pennsylvania, there are more lobbyists than there are state legislators. And this, I think, is one of the secrets of corruption in America that really never gets much attention. There's plenty of reporters and press to cover what's happening in the national government. But in virtually every state capital in America, there are very few reporters left still covering state government. So basically, the greatest corruption, in my mind, is occurring at the state levels. And it doesn't matter the state that you focus on. It's happening in all of them because there's no one covering the shenanigans that go on, as was one of the people mentioned, at the state level. Talk about this impact in these state legislatures of these huge petrochemical industries.
Yeah, thanks. It really has the unfortunate effect of tipping decisions away from what most people want and what most people want for their communities to special interests. That is in the form of just even considering a project to begin with. So the Shell plant in Beaver County, Shell self-financed that plant. It was disclosed this week that they spent $14 billion building it, if you believe their number. A lot of that money went to local politicians to make sure that that plant moved forward. It is impacted in who runs the government and the Department of Environmental Protection in each state, who's in charge, what priorities they set, all the way down to when there are hearings about permits, air permits and water permits, and what is permitted to move forward. So in the Shell case, they grandfathered in the water emissions permit. The site itself was completely, it was a former zinc smelter plant. They wiped the site clean, but allowed them to use the water permit from that former zinc smelter because it was grandfathered in under different standards. The air permit, the same thing. Our DEP allowed them to convert NOx permits into VOC permits, volatile organic compound permits, because there weren't enough VOC permits, and the DEP allowed that to happen. So it goes all the way down to those micro decisions about what's allowed to move forward. And I'd just like to make one last point. It goes all the way down to the local level as well, too. So that shell plant that was built in Beaver County, it's located in Potter Township. They have a population of 600 people, and it's governed by 3 township supervisors. That's a small area that's carved out to gerrymander decision-making because the surrounding area has hundreds of thousands of people. So they'll target a spot where it's easy to influence the local elected officials to get things into place. That plant will affect tens of thousands, if not, 1 million to 2 million people from its emissions. But 3 township supervisors, oftentimes working part-time, are taxed with making decisions about whether something like that can move forward. And money makes a huge difference in situations like that. It makes it very difficult to stop them. It doesn't make it impossible, though. And there's a lot of community organizing that can be done to mitigate that. And I'm sure we can talk about that.
Okay, we're going to take a look at one more clip from the film, and then we're going to entertain not only questions from the audience, but some questions that I'll throw out to the panelists. So let's look at this last clip.
I believe there are only 2 clips we were showing, and we just showed them both.
Oh, that's 2. Okay, my mistake there. I thought we had 3. Okay, so let's begin with some additional questions. One question from the audience, which is pretty interesting, is from Dayla. She's asked, what kind of just transition work is being done in these communities where obviously residents do depend on jobs, and the propaganda of the industry is we're bringing jobs, we're bringing economic development to a community that is distressed. So I don't know who, Kimberly, do you want to tackle this, the issue of just transition away from these kinds of plants?
Yes, and you may have to jump in because I could go on about this all day. But I want to first challenge that narrative. So we know from our recent research that people of color in Louisiana have about half the jobs that you would expect in the petrochemical industry. So they are systematically underrepresented. It's not just Louisiana, it's across the nation. And our state has had petrochemical plants since the 60s. If this was the solution to poverty, we wouldn't be one of the poorest states in the nation. So I really want to also emphasize Matt's point that a lot of this comes down to local decision making. And at the local level, there's a lot of opportunities to use different strategies to promote economic development. Again, in our state, we see a lot of subsidies and tax incentives for petrochemical development. Those kinds of incentives could go towards different types of fields. And I think I want to kind of conclude by saying I think it's really important not to assume that the community that has an oil refinery is going to be okay with a, blue hydrogen plant or some other type of toxin emitting facility that's being promoted in the name of energy transition, right? So climate goals are really important. We also have to think about the local impacts. And if one of these, alternative plants needs an air permit, that means it's emitting toxic pollution. And we need to think about the impacts on local air quality and social justice in those fence line communities.
Okay, and there's another question from Heather, who's in the audience. And those of you in the audience, please use the chat format to send in questions. Heather asks, I've heard of fracking, but not cracking. Can you explain what ethane cracker plants do? Matt, do you want to tackle that one?
Sure, thanks. The lingo makes it sound so like not harmful, but it really is. Fracking is the use of high pressure water, millions of gallons of it injected in wells underground to break up rock to get gas that's trapped in shale areas that's been there for, thousands of years, somewhere 5,000 to, 15, 20,000 feet underground in horizontally drilled wells. And so the gas comes up, a lot of toxic stuff comes up too, like all that water, millions of gallons of water comes back contaminated, sometimes with radiological constituents that are down there. Certainly that water then, needs to go somewhere. And so that is a toxic legacy of fracking. The gas itself is captured. The different types of gas comes up. Methane, a lot of that is used for power plant generation and for, stovetop cooking. But there are also heavier molecules like ethane that comes up. And so an ethane cracker is a facility, it's a large industrial facility that takes ethane that comes up from these wells, and it subjects it to high pressure and temperature to essentially rearrange the molecules to transform ethane into ethylene or polyethylene, which is the building blocks of most plastic products. So that's the process and the difference. The entire chain, however, emits toxic air emissions and water emissions and contaminates land and creates health problems.
And Dr. Kataya, I wanted to ask you, has the Shell plastic plant increased the fracking of natural gas, and how serious are the health hazards from your perspective? And also, in your opinion, has the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection been doing enough to monitor and regulate the industry?
I'll take the last question first and say no, the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection has not done enough as far as permitting. They're permitting everything regarding to fracking and cracking. And the Department of Health in Pennsylvania is also AWOL in educating health providers about what their patients are being exposed to, and that's a huge problem. What is being with the need for more cracking for plastic, yes, it increases the demand for fracked gas, for methane to run the ethane cracker, as well as ethane to make the plastic nurdles, which go into single-use plastic. And the health harms, if you're looking at the chemicals with fracking and also with cracking, the chemicals that get into the air, that get into the water, that get into the soil, that cause health harms are very, very similar. They're fine particle pollution, volatile organic compounds, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which act as endocrine disruptors. And many of these chemicals are carcinogens. There's a whole radioactive legacy from the toxic materials that are brought up from the ground, as well as heavy metals come up that are damaging, particularly to children. So whether we're talking about fracking the gas up from the ground and all that comes up with it, whether we're talking about the chemical reactions to turn that ethane into ethylene and polymerizing it into polyethylene nurdles, the closer you live to fracking, the closer you live to ethane crackers and plastics facilities, petrochemical facilities. We've learned in Pennsylvania, we've learned in Louisiana, the closer you live, the higher the risk of getting sick. And again, I'll finish by saying nobody should be surprised by that.
And also the fracking industry supposedly had a boom and then a bust, right? So has there been a resurgence in Pennsylvania of efforts at fracking?
Yeah, I think in Pennsylvania, where I'm from, fracking decreased in the early years of the pandemic, but with the cracker plant coming on, with a lot of gas being exported to other countries now, I think fracking has picked up quite a bit. And what we're concerned about is this idea that you can take methane and turn it into hydrogen, so-called blue hydrogen, which is only going to increase the need for more methane to be extracted through fracking in the future. It's a terrible idea, this blue hydrogen, but it seems to be coming into reality.
And Kimberly, I saw you nodding when he mentioned blue hydrogen. You want to chime in on that?
Yeah, so we have a client that is represented by our clinic from a little community called St. Rose, which is also a free town, which is a place that was established by people who had been formerly enslaved in the late 1800s. And from her bedroom window, she can see a massive petrochemical tank. And this facility has just proposed to build a blue hydrogen plant within its footprint. So in addition to the petrochemical pollution, now she's facing a massive amount of ammonia pollution. And even though it would be supposedly within the legal limit in Louisiana, our limits are so out of date. And so that plant could not be constructed in a state like Massachusetts, for example, because Massachusetts has stricter limits on the amount of ammonia allowable in the air. So I think it's really important for people to understand that while nationally we may be talking about transitioning from one type of energy source to another, many of the communities that were put in harm's way from traditional types of energy are still facing those problems while they are also facing new pollution sources from alternative facilities.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask, Matt. In a situation where our federal government is continuing to say it's moving toward more sustainable energy in the future, how is it that these massive, now really massive projects on a scale unimagined in the past are getting permitted?
Yeah, well, what I want to say is that, many of us tried to not get that shell plant permitted. And, with successful organizing, at one time, there was a call to have up to 5 of those plants through the Ohio River Valley in Ohio and West Virginia. And I think pushback from community, contributed to driving away investors from making that a possibility. It's clear that it's just not a good idea to be spending and investing this way. These are very likely to be stranded assets. They lock some very negative things into place for a long period of time at exactly the wrong time. And it's clear we need to go in a different direction. A couple of things I wanted to point out. In the 2012 to 2016 era, when our state was very heavily pro-fracking and moving forward, people were sold arguments like, well, it keeps the cost of natural gas low for people. I just want to point out this week, our region's largest utility for natural gas is asking for rate increases for people. And it's because of this idea they want to sell things overseas. They want to ship it around the world. And now our electricity is tied increasingly to natural gas for generation of electricity. And so people's electricity bills are going up. So what was originally sold as, well, this keeps your costs low, is just, was just a way anyone who pushes things on people to get them hooked on something, that's what we're seeing with natural gas. The other is the fact that there was all these promises that it would help grow the economy in the region. That the analysis has come out where Beaver County, where this plant is located, lost even more people than places that never embraced fracking but have the same characteristics around our state and around the country. So it is a completely failed strategy for any sort of economic development. And why people keep doing it is just because of the influence system that exists for pushing it. And that's what people need to know about. And it's what people need to know to call out to prevent from happening.
And to follow up on that, even the jobs claim that is often made, the jobs are almost always largely construction jobs of the actual facilities, not ongoing jobs for the community, aren't they? Because these are very capital intensive industries.
They're temporary jobs on the order of, a year or two. and they're not local people, that there's a cadre of workers that go from site to site from around the world and around the country. And they're the ones who get these jobs. And they come, our state provided a $1.65 billion tax break for the Shell facility. It's the largest tax break in Pennsylvania history. And it was all for jobs, but really all it did was subsidize this mobile workforce that moved around. And Pennsylvania taxpayers are on the hook now for 25 years of tax breaks for this company that is just gonna, it's already within 6 months, it violated its very generous air permits. Okay, every month, 6 months after it started up. And it's been fined $12 million. Every month there are violations being tallied against the company for water and air and land contamination violations. And all of this was known was going to be happening through the process. So communities need to take note of this. They need to learn to not go down this path and to try to prevent it at the very earliest stages.
We have another question from someone in the audience from Woody. Are there any petrochemical companies that have moved away from single-use plastic to those that can be recycled? Anyone of the panelists want to tackle that, or?
I'll jump in and say, I can just jump in and say there's an initiative called Reimagine Beaver County that is looking to try to build out an alternatives to plastic industry there. That it's possible to make materials from hemp and from mycelium, from mushrooms, that it creates a much less toxic process for getting similar materials that have similar performance characteristics. And so there are efforts to do that, and these materials don't have the same, scale and toxic legacy. It's really difficult, though, to get something like this started. It's capital intensive. It's hard to compete on price. It's hard to access markets. But it is being done at a small scale, one step at a time. I think we're going to see more of this going forward.
And Kimberly, I wanted to ask you, the Louisiana Appellate Court, reversing a previous lower court ruling, has affirmed the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality's decision to issue the air permits for Mosa Plastics needs to build their complex. Your reaction, and what's been the hope of people on the ground who are in opposition to what they can do?
It was a deeply disappointing decision, but there is still legal recourse for those community members, right? So the story is not over. They haven't exhausted their legal avenues. And Formosa also needs a wetlands permit from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to construct, because the massive site where they want to put this plant is on wetlands. So they don't currently have all the permits that they need. And it's a perfect example of why a multi-tiered advocacy strategy is so important, right? Because you might have success in delaying the wetlands permit, and you might have an early success with the air permit, but then it's 2 steps back and a few steps forward. So, it remains to be seen how the story will play out. I will also say that original court ruling at the district court level, the judge issued some very powerful language about the State Department of Environmental Quality needing to fully consider environmental justice rather than paying lip service to it. So those words are forever, and that's always going to be a victory that the community has and can point to and can build from.
And Dr. Gatayer, this whole issue, I want to get back to a just transition away from single-use plastics. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that what has to happen really is there has to be a fuller discussion about health impacts for the folks that are being exposed to these emissions and these chemicals. The Formosa plant, the decisions made for that, the decisions made for the Shell cracker plant, the decisions that are made every day in frackland communities, allowing infrastructure to be built. Health is seldom factored in into those decisions. The discussion seldom happens regarding health. I'm starting to see a change in that around the country, which is important. You know, physicians, health providers, we're concerned with the health of people. The economy is not our expertise, it's the health of people. And we have to keep everyone in mind when it comes to environmental protection and health protection, public health protection. Equitable transition, yes, please. But the folks that are making the decisions need to be better educated and have a little bit more common sense when it comes to public health.
And Matt, there's another question from our audience, which focuses on the consumers. Don't you think we need to educate and push consumers to reuse versus single use? And if we do, there'll be less demand for plastics.
Well, I'll say yes and no to that. Let me start with the no first. So the reason for the no is the plastic industry has for decades put the onus on the consumer for recycling. Okay, they produce these products and they put them in the world, and then at the end of how it's used, it's the person that bought it's responsibility to figure out what to do with it. And then that's a local cost to local municipal governments to collect it. And it's very inefficient. It doesn't work very well. And so for putting this all on the consumer doesn't make sense. What does make sense is a producer responsibility law, that if you're going to make this stuff, you're responsible for it, not only after it's sold, but throughout that entire packaging product's existence or product's existence. And you're responsible for taking it back when you're done. There are electronics recycling laws that work this way in different parts of the country. Those need to be strengthened as well too, but a producer responsibility law where the onus of collecting these materials, belongs on them. Now, with that being said, people also need to pay attention to what they're buying. If there's something that can be purchased that is an alternative material that it doesn't end up in a landfill, then it makes sense for a consumer to be aware of built-in obsolescence, how marketing drives consumption, and the artificial consumption of plastic goods. And so, I think it's got to work at both levels, but what's missing is a producer responsibility level.
And how practically would that producer responsibility work? Are you talking about extra taxation on the product or some direct reclaiming of the product?
There are versions of bills that, describe this pending at the federal level. Various U.S. senators and congresspeople have proposed this. Most of them have a provision that if you are a producer of these materials, you have to pay a significant amount into a fund that is used for the management of this. So you pay upfront and contribute to a solution for the collection of these things. And it's not local government and local people that have to pay for it. So that's one key provision for it.
I'd like to just ask one last question, and then we're going to ask each of the panelists to make closing remarks. This is to you, Dr. Kataya. The whole issue of microplastics that end up in our bodies, could you enlighten some of our audience who may not know about that?
Sure. As plastic breaks down in the environment or in landfills, in our oceans, in the soil, they break down into smaller and smaller pieces of plastic. Those are called microplastics. And those microplastics can float up in the air far, far away to the most distant mountaintops and the most remote places, to the deepest trenches in our oceans. And they get everywhere. In fact, there is evidence that when it rains anywhere in the world, it rains microplastics. So it gets into us. The chemicals that are used to make plastic, to give plastic its its properties that we find so useful. Those chemicals are not tightly bound to the plastic polymers, and so they, like a time-release capsule, they release those chemicals over time, over years and decades, and perhaps even centuries, as plastic gets smaller and smaller into those microplastics. And they get into us, and they cause enormous damage at very, very small concentrations, particularly when we're talking about endocrine disruption, which affects our hormones, affects reproduction, affects the development of fetuses and young infants, and can cause cancer. So it's the toxic chemicals just keep on giving, and that's why this is really a long-term human health problem that we need to be aware of and we need to tackle.
Okay, well, I want to give time here for each of our panelists to give a 2-minute summation of anything you think we may have missed in this discussion, and again, the importance of people seeing this film and spreading the word about the film. And we'll start with Kim Terrell.
Thanks. Yeah, I want to kind of emphasize the importance of engaging with the local community, and also exercising common sense, right? If all these plants were so good for the local economy, Louisiana should be one of the richest states in the nation, right? We should not be last in almost every health outcome that has been documented. And we also really need to push back on this narrative of there's no alternative. In St. James Parish, where Formosa Plastics is trying to build its plant, the parish council passed a moratorium, not on petrochemical development, but on solar farms. So in 2022, the parish said, hey, we're concerned about the effect of solar farms on the agricultural character of our parish. Meanwhile, we're planning to build this massive 14-unit mega plastic manufacturing complex. So I think a lot of times we can really learn a lot from the people who are on the ground and living in these communities. And engaging with them is really important, while also respecting the fact that they are incredibly overstretched, have very little bandwidth, and are usually doing this incredible organizing work for no pay in a volunteer capacity. So I think groups like, Physicians for Social Responsibility and the Breathe Project, and, those nonprofits across the US have a really important role to play in elevating local community members and taking some of the burden off of them and helping find strategies towards real lasting solutions. So thank you so much for the opportunity to share.
Okay, and Matt, your final comments?
Yeah, thanks. I will double down on what Kim just said. I want to thank her for her comments of elevating local community as essential to this. That cannot be emphasized enough. And I'm so thankful for the community members who step forward, who spend the time, who engage, and are so committed in our region for pushing back on this. I will connect it with two other key points that I think people need to know about. One is our state has a constitutional amendment that guarantees the right to clean air and clean water to every resident of our Commonwealth, that the elected officials are supposed to be in stewardship of all of our air, land, and water that's held in common for the benefit of all. And so any elected official that is engaged with taking money to promote one interest that leaves a toxic legacy is actually working against the constitutional right of every citizen and community member in Pennsylvania. And the last point I want to make is one other problem we face in our state is, with the Shell plant, they've paid now about $12 million in fines in a year for all of their emission violations. And $12 million at one level sounds like a lot of money, but for Shell, which their annual profit last year was close to $70 billion, that's like the equivalent fine of buying a Starbucks cup of coffee for the average Beaver County in Pennsylvania. And so we have this what we call a pay to pollute model in our state, that if there's unlawful activity, it usually results in some sort of civil penalty, financial penalty. And where we need to get more aggressive is looking at criminal liability for violations of some of these things, that people's lives are permanently altered and harmed, families are disrupted from what gets created when these plants get put into place. And when people are not following the law, which grants a whole lot of leeway, there should be a lot more effort for holding people criminally responsible. And I think then we might see some change in behavior.
Okay, and a final word from Dr. Ned Kataya.
Thank you, Juan. I just want to take a moment to thank the filmmakers for making this film, and for the panelists for making this conversation possible and so interesting. My grandmother used to say that if you don't have your health, you don't have anything at all. And she was right, of course. She lived to 101. We're talking about real people. We're talking about their health. This is what's really important to us. During the film, a lot of time is spent on the political reality that we face in all our states, whether it's Pennsylvania, Louisiana, or elsewhere. Most politicians, the vast majority in local politics or state houses or in Congress, most politicians aren't doctors or nurses, and very few of them, based on what we've seen in this movie, very few of them are mothers and grandmothers. Our politicians don't have a deep understanding of science or of nature or of health. Many have a hole where empathy should be. It's money and power that our politicians understand, and too many of them deny the harm caused by fossil fuels, petrochemicals, and plastics. But the damage is done, and it continues, and the consequences for our children's future, we understand now, are profound, and we need to find a better way. So thank you very much.
Okay, well, I'd want to thank all three panelists, Dr. Ned Kataya, President of Physicians for Social Responsibility of Pennsylvania, Matt Mihalik, Executive Director of the Breathe Project, and Kim Terrell of Staff Scientist at Tulane University. Again, the film is Single Use Planet. Don't miss it when it comes to your town. Spread the word, and hopefully we can do something dramatic to change the crisis that we're facing from these single-use plastic products. So thank you for the audience for your questions and for your attention. Let's keep the struggle going. I'm Juan Gonzalez as your moderator this afternoon.